Thank you for having me. Whenever I hear that introduction, two thoughts come to mind. One is I'm old. Two is I don't have a police record. That is not why I keep moving. It's always better jobs. It makes it sound like I'm running from Interpol, kind of thing. So I'm going to talk about the MSPE today, and only one disclosure. So we recently had at UCSF our spring all-day medical education UME retreat, and we decided to, as an exercise, do a what would the best MSPE look like in 5 years from now as a way to start us talking. And the one disclosure I have is they started asking all the questions that we asked in 2013, and I got PTSD. It was like, I'm so tired of talking about the MSPE. I'm not really, but it was a lot of work. So I'm going to talk about the background, where we were when we started, the process we used, because I think that was a particularly useful process that we're now trying to duplicate at AAMC. A little bit of the content. You've all seen the content of what the changes are. Some of the outcomes. So we have a lot of outcomes about who's using it, and as well as from program directors, and talk about some of the next steps. And what you'll see that I'm going to talk about is a lot of what the MSP is not. And some of what we learned that needs to happen as we move forward with that. Feel free to interrupt me if I lapse into psychobabble or AAMC like letter stuff. Stop me and ask me what I'm talking about. So the first slide, this is to remind us that the MSPE is part of an overall transition from UME to GME and part of the sequence there. This is only part of it. There's a variety of other things that are going, because one of the things that we had to start off with is everyone wanted the MSPE to fix everything about that, which of course is impossible because there's a lot of issues going on with the transition. And this is just a partial list of what's going on. The one I wanted that I'm actually quite excited about, and I think some of you have heard about, is the AAMC NRMP tools. There's a new thing coming out. There was a pilot last year, and it's going to be done again this year, where NRMP and AAMC have partnered to actually pull together data that they have. So a student will be able to enter in the specialty they're going into, what their parameters are as far as research and scores and things like that, and they'll get a list of programs in that specialty where people like them matched. So, which is a really useful tool. We're actually starting to harness the data that we had, and that partially came out of some of the things we did with this. At the very bottom is specialty-specific programs. I just wanted to highlight that because what started happening, because we weren't addressing some of the things I'm going to talk about with the MSPE, specialties started doing it on their own, and ortho started doing things, and they're mostly the surgical subspecialties. My favorite was I think it was ENT, hired an external company to actually survey happy and successful ENT residents and attending, get their personality qualities, and then do sort of a match dating kind of thing to give information on that. And so, that became particularly onerous for our students because there's even more things to fill out, but it was a sign to us that we really needed to address the gulf between what was needed and what was not. So let me go back just a little bit about the history, because I was a little bit surprised when I took this over. This is when I was in medical school here at Columbia. And '89 was the first time there came a concerted national effort to actually do something about what the MSPE looked like. So at that point, I think there were 130 or 120 medical schools, and there were probably about 125 different ways of doing MSPEs. They weren't organized, they weren't at all done. Then a lot of change happened in 2000 to 2003. That's when it got renamed the MSPE. Not all of them previously had included all the core clerkships, so they identified that. Two key things was, instead of, because every school was doing it by committee, by different people, many schools, a secretary was doing it. They didn't really understand what was residency we were looking at. So it got designated, there would be a designated person, typically the student affairs dean or the curricular dean. But the other thing that was new then was student review. So students got to see their letter for the first time. The reason that's important is because that's a FERPA rule. The MSPE is part of the official record, and students have the right to do that. And that's the other thing that we had to keep in mind as we were doing the MSPE, is this is the record that follows you for the rest of your career. I just went back to UCSF, as Rita said, 2 years ago, and had to get re-credentialed, and I got to see my MSPE from 1989. Which is a little bit frightening. Linda Lewis was the dean there, and I was like, I don't even remember half of what was in there, and there's a variety of other things. This also began at the bottom of the slide, that sort of moving of the dates. I don't know, those of you who've been around knew that the dates have moved when the MSPE is due, when ARIS opens, when programs have access to it. 2004, no one remembers this, but professionalism assessment form came out. This becomes important because this is the one thing we still don't do well at all, but we've had something for 14 years that none of us really used or knew about, and it didn't get standardized. And then 2011 was the last time that dates moved again. So that's when we moved to where we currently are now. The MSPE moved up a month, and the ARIS opening moved back 2 weeks. We had tried to get them to align, but the programs really didn't want that to happen. So in 2014, when I was asked to chair this, first of all, they said, you can do this in a year. We're still doing it. It's 2019, so 5 years in. I did not buy that bridge. I knew it would take longer than a year. What were the issues? So the issues were, at the time, there were 146 medical schools, 143 medical schools, completely inconsistent across medical schools. And there were some medical schools where things were inconsistent within the medical school because they were writing about different clerkships, and the clerkships were doing different things, the way they were evaluating it. The range of length of the letters was between 2 and 19 pages. So there was a school whose average was 2.5. There was a school whose average was 19 pages. You know, I'm a psychiatrist by training. I'm a student advocate. I don't want to read 19 pages about myself, much less somebody else. That's just a ridiculously long thing. And keep in mind, that's before we had the glut of people applying. You know, right now, ER programs that take 10 people get 3,000 applications they have to go through. Internal medicine is getting 5,000 applications. The average number of applications, and this is somewhat of an odd number, not true number, of people that applied this past year, ARIS applications, was 89. In the 80s, 79 or 80, I think. But that includes all comers, IMGs and everything. For US grads, it was in the 30s to 40s, depending on the specialty. So it's still really high. And lastly, the last two thing was that it was missed opportunity. One of the things is there were things in the MSPE that duplicated what was in the rest of the application. So we had this 2 to 19 page thing that wasn't doing the job, that no one was happy with. It was a lot of work for those of us that wrote it, and people weren't reading it. And the challenges continued. So right now there's 152 medical schools, not counting the 900 medical schools in the rest of the world, and the DO schools. Jeff and I did a live webinar for ECFMG, and there were 200 countries represented on that. And all of a sudden I began to realize we thought we were tackling 150, 900 medical schools with different languages. It was amazing. But we've been relying on a supply of physicians from around the world to help us take care of healthcare here. Hopefully that is allowed to continue. But the schools, different pedagogies, different priorities, very different curricula across schools, assessment approaches. One of the big things they had to deal with normative versus criterion-based is schools move more toward criterion-based, as well as assessment approaches. Different schools use different tools, different levels of faculty development. And the other big issue that we had to deal with is what do you report, particularly around professionalism and or academic difficulties? How do you report it? Does it have to be remediated? What's the level? Different schools were doing different things, and the schools that were reporting more heavily on professionalism and things like that felt like they were getting penalized because they were reporting on it, nobody else was. And so their students were being judged. We also talked to the program director. So the biggest thing, I'm a student affairs dean, I've never been a program director, was I've had access in the last 4.5 years, to the NRMP program director survey, which is hundreds of pages and 450 to 600 pages of comments alone, not including the survey. And that sounds onerous. It's actually really fascinating reading because you know how we say in medical school, you've seen one medical school, you've seen one medical school. You see one residency program, you've seen one residency program. We like to think that they're this cohesive, all the surgeons move together and all the psych, they don't. So what are their problems? Limited resources. We in medical school get 8 to 12,000 applications, but we have casts of 40 to 100 people doing it. As I said, they're getting 2,000 to 5,000, and it's like a program director and 2 other people that have clinical responsibilities. I can probably pick out who the program director is here by how vigorously you're shaking your heads, right? It's stressful. The high volume that you get, and those numbers are only going up. There's competing pressures. You're both an employer and a teacher. You answer to your specialty organization, you answer to your department chair who answers to the dean. The first question, typically that a department chair walks in and asks is, did we fill our slots and how low on the list did we have to go? Which may be counter to what your mission is. There's difficulty comparing information within schools, not to mention across schools, and the real issue was lack of personal information, reliable information about the student. So what our charge was to look at what'd been done with MSPEs, to review the literature on standardized assessments. We looked at a variety of things, both that are already being used. So what was then the SLOR and now is the SLOE in emergency medicine. We looked closely at that. We had the benefit of that having been up and running for, it's now been 10 years, so at that time it was 5 or 6 years, so we had some data from that. We looked across other things outside of medicine to see how they standardize things. McKinsey actually does a fair amount of standardization. We went to the consulting literature. We also went back and looked at the UME. So AMCAS had been doing a lot of things. So one of the things that AMCAS had already done that we ultimately followed was, when you rank your experiences on AMCAS applying to medical school, you have to pick the 3 most important ones and salient and describe that. We mirrored that when we went to unique characteristics. We also wanted to look at objective holistic review principles. I'm going to talk about that just briefly a little bit more. And we struggled with that a little bit because many of our I was actually someone that did training for admissions committees around the country for a holistic review. And one of the things that we realized is that we brought students into medical school holistically. Residencies may or may not be doing that. And not to mention medical schools may or may not be doing something to support people that they have now brought in that are coming from different backgrounds. We're very proud at UCSF, our first year class is 10% African American men. And here's the real interesting aside is no more numbers applied. We didn't accept more people came. And looking at what that has been about. But in what it's been about is really holistically, and a shout out to Angel here, for holistically doing student affairs to support people. And the word has gotten out that we do things like that, so people are coming. And also look at threshold for standardization. So one of the things that I worked very closely with Jeff Young, who is the Director of Student Affairs and Programs, we decided that we wanted to pull together a very large pretty large task force, but there were specific groups we wanted. So one of our first steps was, the process was we wanted to be holistic in the way we looked at this and bring everyone to the table. So as you can see, there's a big D dean, there are program director people, there are specialty societies, there are education deans, assessment deans, student affairs deans, resident. We also added, we have someone from AACOM, so we had the DEOs represented, and we wanted to get all pictures. We didn't stop there, though. And and the other thing, at the bottom of the list of people, one of the things that AAMC is wonderful about is you ask a question, someone there goes off and does the research and brings it all back to you. So the first year we were doing this work was really reviewing the literature and looking at what we knew and what other people knew about things. This is the list of where we went to get feedback. Concerted effort. I felt like I was on the Barnum and Bailey circus tour. I went to more meetings, Jeff and I, than you can imagine, but we thought it was really important. Took exhaustive notes, let people know when they made suggestions that if we couldn't follow them, why we couldn't. And that gets to building allies around how to move forward. But as you can see, it covers a very wide thing. The one that starred, the Group on Student Affairs, Steering Committee on Student Affairs, that's just to remind me to say something that I've already said, which is that this is an official document, and so we had to keep that in mind. It's a legal document as well. We felt the need early to say what the MSP was not going to do. We could not define professionalism. I'm going to talk about that a little bit at the end, and we still haven't defined professionalism because nobody's been successful at defining professionalism. It's the same issue when you apply from college to medical school to residency, residency to fellowship, fellowship into jobs. We're not good at assessing that. Resolve the variability of clerkship variation and evaluations across the schools. We can't do that. There's 152 medical schools. There is an effort that started about that I'll tell you about at the end as well. We could not standardize grading. That's not our job. It's up to the individual school. We don't require and couldn't require students to rank their units, and this is my favorite. We cannot make it fit on one page. We actually had a specialty that said they wanted half a page with numbers. I'll let you guess which specialty that was. And yes, they do surgery. So we made it very clear what we're not doing. The other thing is looking at how we could promote holistic review of this. And one of the things that we realized as we were talking with the holistic review people at WMC and across the country is really taking the stance that holistic review is you can't force someone to do it. You can give them the information, but it's actually done by the person doing the reviewing, and that we needed to make things available. And we haven't done that quite as well as we had hoped. I'll get to reason what that is shortly. But we hope to move forward with that with some of the other enhancements that may be coming. What were the takeaways that we came away from with all this exhaustive meeting? One was it's clearly in the student and the school's best interest to be able to present the student as in-depthly as possible. But the counter to that is no one's going to read 19 pages. And the other part of that is that it has to be reliable information. We can't make schools comply with this, although I'll show you the data about the vast majority of schools are, because it's hard to be the person that's not. And lastly, that it's not a lot of recommendation. So one of the things we asked people to do was to give up that paragraph at the end where the writer makes an assessment. And because that's not the purpose of this letter. There's 4 letters of recommendation for that. And going back to what is it that moves things forward, the MSPE is just part of the application process. These are quickly, you've all seen all these, what we suggested, the recommendations. The one at the bottom, the 7, it was originally 5 pages, and we learned that 5 pages was just way too short, because I went back and tried to write ours, and I was like, oh my gosh, I can't do 5 pages, so we changed it to 7. So those are the recommendations. You can see them anywhere. This is the factors that lead people for interviews. As you can see, the MSPE is number 3. So this is from 2016 study of program directors. I believe it's an N of about 1,300. So it's number 3. What I find fascinating here, though, I'm going to step away from the mic for just a little bit, is if you look down here to evidence of professionalism and ethics, it's down lower, but it's the blue on the right is the average rating scale of 0 to 5 of what they consider important. So there's a little bit of a disconnect. That's actually the second highest thing, second only to failed USMLE, of what program directors consider important. But why is it so low? It's because it was unreliable. They couldn't figure out how to do it, but it's something that's very important to them. We also looked at how our students, our applicants, our students screened in or out of interview, and roughly 50% on average of students are screened out without even looking at the application, based on the screen set on ARIS. Can be step 1, step 2, a combination of the two. It's visa stuff, it's having failed things. Some schools, specialties, look at if you didn't get honors in the 3rd year of that rotation. UCSF Medicine used to do that, we don't anymore. So there was screening out, and only 44% got actually really looked at. That's the average. I suspect that that's gone down as the number of applications have gone up for program directors. So what do we know about how people, where we are as far as moving forward with things? So we went from unique characteristics to noteworthy characteristics, and 95% of Dean's letters, this is the 2017-2018 Dean's letters, MSPE, followed that. So we were quite satisfied with that. 81 limited to 3 bullet points. One of the ways that we heard from program directors why they like that, and there's a slide later, is that they looked at that as sort of a table of contents of something that caught their eye that they would then dive deeper in to look at about the student. Interestingly enough, we did get some strong pushback from some people, not about the number but what was included on that. So there was one of the first examples that we sent out. We took real MSPEs and redacted them to do that, and we sent one out that we'd gotten particularly good feedback on, and it was a female medical student who listed that she had a baby. There was a group, and understandably in retrospect, there was a group of actually women deans of medical schools across the country who were like, what are you doing? And so we took that down, and one of the things we started looking at, and we're just now following up with, is how do we educate people about gender and other biases that are in evaluations and letters. And there's extensive literature in business literature, promotions and letters of recommendation, where women are described as what are considered the softer things. They're good negotiators, they're good this, and they had a kid. But and men are described more as hard-hitting, blah, blah. But the big thing that we noticed when we went back and looked around the issue around childbirth is there's several studies done in business that looked at whether people saw having a child positively or negatively. It was a positive thing if you were a man, a negative thing if you were a woman. So we have a fair amount of work to do. Again, the MSP, we weren't going to address that. We sort of sidebar. This is one of my favorite and most interesting slides here. So back in 2015, which is the last year before we implemented it, only 12% of MSPEs mentioned anything about professionalism. As of 2018, we're up to 81%, so that was a significant increase, obviously. But as I said, we haven't defined it, and it varies from school to school, so it's not reliable from a program director's perspective. We also have been successful in decreasing the length. Despite the fact that we moved some of the things that were in the appendix into the actual letter, the graphs, the average length is now 6.3 pages. So that's dramatically down. Keep in mind, if you look at 2016, almost 40% of letters were over 9 pages. So, and they're actually getting read. One of the things that will eventually happen is that it will probably go to a web-based electronic on ARIS. We can't do that until, also, given what happened with SOAP, I'm glad it wasn't in on ARIS. But we can't do that until we finalize it, because you can't change that every year. So that'll actually hold people to character things, but more importantly, it'll also tell us, we'll be able to see what people are looking at and for how long. So we'll get some ideas about some things there. I've already mentioned most of these things. We changed the length. We still need to address professionalism. One of the things that we made a key push for was to list both good things as well as lapses in professionalism, so if it was exemplary, and that brought a lot more people on board. I think people were feeling more comfortable reporting negative things if they could then report that the person went on and remediated and did positive things. So adding that positive made a difference. The other thing was looking at the summary statement. If someone made a summary statement, when we first looked, I think there were like 70 different adjectives that MSPEs used at the end to describe the student finally, and no one knew what it meant, except that good means you suck, right? And anything less than outstanding is bad. But no one described that. So one of the things that we recommended is, if you're going to use adjectives, describe what they mean. Are they quintiles, are they quartiles, what are they based on, kind of thing. So at least the program directors know what's happening. So what do program directors think? What is the data from them? So in the end of 2017, beginning of 2018, we sent out surveys independent of the NRMP. This is just from AAMC and MSPE, surveys to all, at the time, 9,300, 9,500 programs. And we got it back a total N of 1,200. We got originally 810 and sent out a second one to the people who had not responded to the first one. And what did we find out from them? It's broken down a little bit by specialty. Do you agree with and like and recommend the new guidelines? 80% said yes. It varies from across the specialties, but the lowest I think was surgery at 75%. They wanted the one page. Interestingly enough, when we were able to look at, and we had the data because we looked at the MSPEs, which were conforming, the program director's perspective is that fewer were conforming than actually were. And we're not really sure why that was, why their perception was that. We thought we had some successes. I was able to easily identify the information I was seeking, and I was able to quickly yet thoroughly review the MSPEs because they knew where to go and they knew how to find what they were looking for. We didn't do so well with how would they fit. I have some trouble with that word because fit means you're looking for people that are just like you, kind of thing, but we didn't do so well with that. What do they use it for? The vast majority of them use it to look for red flags, which means they're trying to read between the lines. So that's why good is bad, and depending on what the clerkship was written in the clerkship can be problematic. Just over 60% used it to identify who to interview. 87% thought that MSPE should contain comparative data across students and across schools, which was something that many schools don't want to do as far as an easy rating. I was telling people at UCSF, we just, with the current F2, our MS3 year, stopped doing honors. So it's pass-fail for the first 3 years. And thinking that we wanted to make third year more formative, and of course that puts more pressure in some ways on step one. But the INCUS, there's some hopeful information coming out of the INCUS group about changing that. So where did they find the value? In the academic progress. And by academic progress, that means being able to look across the time that people were going through rotations to see, were they consistent? Was there improvement? So they weren't just looking at theirs. One of the things that was actually, this reveals one of my biases, is meeting with some of the surgery and surgery subspecialty people. The lore had been they only look at surgery and the final adjective. Many of them read other things. And I was shocked to find out that many of them read things like family medicine and psychiatry. And when I asked why, and this is considered, it's because we don't want someone that only excels at what they like. Because they may love the gallbladder, but they're going to hate the thyroid. So we want people that work hard across everything. And I just found that very refreshing and an interesting approach to do things. They also found the academic history useful and the summary was useful. Interestingly, the noteworthy characteristics, just over 60%, so two-thirds of people almost thought that was useful. As I said, what we were hearing is that people were using it as a table of contents to go in and read more in depth about what was being used. So when we asked the program directors what is important for assessing resident success, you can see that the top 5 are actually covered in the MSPE, and in many ways are covered there in a ways that they can't be covered elsewhere. So that gave us a little bit of a focus, and I think also some ideas about where we want to do as we move forward. I would also add the personality, whatever that actually means, is something that can get covered in the MSPE as well. Any questions about the data, where we are? So let me talk about some of the takeaways that we learned. That despite everything we've done, there's still a gulf between what medical schools want to present as far as who their students are and what residencies want to hear. The struggle is still about professionalism and those kinds of things, and part of it is because we're not sure how to assess it, and also we don't want to be penalized for moving it forward. The issue being that there's not going to be a single tool that can do that. The other thing is that the MSP is only as good as the data that goes into it. Which is a key thing, because with 152 medical schools, each with 8 or 9 clerkships that are going in and each of those clerkships may have a different grading rubric, and there are schools, despite LCME's efforts, that grades are different depending on the site you're at, the grading is. So there's lots to be concerned about there. One of the things we realized is that there need to be some more faculty development on assessment. We can't standardize that if it's not uniformly agreed upon across schools. Communicating and defining professionalism is going to be a big, difficult bear. And the other thing that was a barrier, at least initially, and it still is for some schools, is the IT capabilities. The simple act of moving the graphs from the appendix into the letter of where that person stood was beyond many medical schools' capabilities. We actually had to send out a thing about how to do it with Excel and Word to get it done for people, because schools have widely different accessibility to IT. What were the sort of softer or other things that we learned? One was that this was a lesson in change management. One of the things that I had the benefit and the team had a benefit of is having all the data and looking at the range of what was being done and stopping to think and actually reviewing the literature on how do you bring thousands of people forward with something that you think is important to do. And so what do? We first, as I said, we picked a diverse team, diverse across specialties, across what they do with UME and GME. We really sought broad input and tried to get input from lots of different people. We sought allies early. So people that, you agreed with this one point, you're our best friend. You disagree with the other 7, you're still our best friend. We're going to work on that. We used a lot of humor. I had, some of you in the room may remember when we first started doing this, the joke was that I would have to wear Kevlar to present this. And I had colleagues that I had known for many, many years get in my face saying, "You've betrayed us. Luckily I'm a psychiatrist. I'm used to people in the emergency room saying, I hate you, you can't put me in prison, but I sort of can because there's holds. So making use of humor kept us going a lot. We had to do a fair amount of coaching of how do you sell this back at your school, who do you talk to, and talking to students. We also had to recognize that there were people who were at multiple different levels. There were people that were promoters, us on the team, certain programmers. There were people that were activators. They were the people that we relied on to actually do this, and we had to get them to understand why it was important and how to do this. And most importantly, there were resistors. And we had resistors on our working group around these things, because we thought it was important to have people there and hear all voices. The resistance was very emotional from a lot of people, just because this was important and they didn't want to betray students. They wanted to really present that. And for many people, it was hard to give up the idea that this was a letter of recommendation. As a student affairs dean, I know my students really, really well. With 99.8% of them, I can pick out really great things and say they should be doctors and that they'll be good doctors. I struggle with what about the other ones that if I'm in the emergency room and they walk in, I'm going to say I'm going to a different emergency room. And we all have those people, and we don't do a great job of taken care of that, which is why, but my answer to that is program directors also don't do a great job of not graduating people from their residency and going on to fellowship. It's a human thing that we do. We realized we had to allow catch-up. So because we were doing this for 2 years and rolling these out, we had to take deep breaths and recognize that people were not where we were. They didn't have the benefit of working with us for 2 years. And so we realized, which is why we went from 1 year to 5 years of stepping back and allowing people to sort of gradually catch up and adjust. And also so we could listen and modify things. There was a fair amount of limit setting. This is not what we are going to do. The MSPE does not do this. We report things. Being able to stay on message, because there's all these great conversations about holistic review and about professionalism that we could have gotten off into that we really couldn't. We didn't have that, and really have a spirit of exploring with the people we were working with, including students, of where do we want to go with this, what do we want this to do, and how does this fit into the overall transition from UME to GME, and oh, by the way, are there things about the overall process that we need to address that we're going to miss if we focus in on the individual parts? The best is the enemy of the good. This was the other thing, is we started out trying to be everything to everybody, and if you do that, that means you do nothing, right? You get nothing done. And being able to go to sleep at night saying you've done good. You've done a good job, and it's not going to be the best, and there's going to be multiple iterations, and you can't make everybody happy, was hard at first. What I have to say now is about 3 years into this process, the meeting tenor went from, we're not going to do this, to, here's how we're doing this, does this work? So there was a clear-cut change, which actually, frankly, surprised me as a psychiatrist, because typically that kind of change takes more than 3 years. I mean, when you think about how long it took people to start wearing seatbelts in this country, it's like 10 years, 20 years, a generation of people to change things. So, and I think what did it was being able to say that, this is in the best interest of your students getting where they want to go and finding the best fit for them in residency. This is just to remind us again that this is one of the tools that's amongst many that we're looking at, and that there's a lot of work to be done around this. The last thing I want to talk about is the tail wagging the dog. So how do people know what to study? So what we assess, how we assess, and when we assess influence how and what students learn. And one of the things that we became very aware of is what we highlighted in MSPE, medical students are bright. They're going to go back and realize, and we've already seen that. It's interesting having gone from having honors in third year to no honors in third year, watching an entire 3 classes try to figure out, how do I game the system? And don't get me, I'm not saying I wouldn't be doing the same thing. I would be doing the exact same thing. If they did something with my salary or my promotion that changed things, I'd be like, okay, how do I work this work for me? And that really has highlighted for us that what goes into the MSPE, because students know and they get to see it and we give them templates, will determine what they focus on. So being really aware of how do we address that at our school, at each of our schools level. And so one of the things that we did at our retreat at UCSF was talking about how do we communicate in the MSPE, along with all the assessments we do, what we think is important and the range of things that we think are important. And how does that distill down to a 7-page letter in a way that communicates that with people? So next steps, and I want to come back and have just general discussion about some of the things, the hot topics. One of the things I said is that the letter's only as good as the data. So as a result of some of the work that this group did across, and many groups at WMC have been working across different, what have been silos before, came up with a template for a couple of projects that the group on student affairs and the group on education affairs wanted to work together. We just had our Western Region meeting in Reno with GEA, GSA, and OSR, Organization of Student Representatives. And we're small. The West is the smallest region, and we have a history of doing that meeting together every year. We used to do it in this rustic place every year. But even there, things are siloed. I go to RIME things, I'm like, what's this format of, and then you go to the student affairs thing, and it's a little softer, a little more psychiatric. So we wanted to sort of do things together. So this is a task force that I'm on, along with several other people, looking at how do we improve across schools what goes into the evaluations. So is it our approach to try to standardize things? No. But is it an approach to sort of maybe standardize how things are written about so that there's more consistency? Yes. Because until we do that, what programs get about students, they still have to rely on some other things like the name of the school, like where the person's from, and things that really shouldn't be part of that. It's not going to answer the need that we have for physicians moving forward in this country. The other, professionalism. If anyone has any ideas on that, I am open to hearing it because we're still struggling with that. We do have some schools, interestingly enough. So University of Arizona in Phoenix now has been for 3 years putting everything in. And so they'll put, when somebody has had a professionalism lapse, they'll put in what it was and whether the person successfully remediated. And of note, they felt like they were being penalized at first, but the most recent thing I've heard from them is, particularly with the ones that have remediated, program directors are happy to hear that. Interestingly enough, when you talk to program directors, like medical schools, no medical school wants 100% of their students to be MD PhDs. We want service, we want leaders, we want primary care. Residency programs are the same way. They want a range of people, and what they don't want is to have 12 out of 14 people be problems. They want 1 or 2, and that they're willing to address that. Where that became evident was with the SLO and the SLOR. And for those of you who haven't seen it, that's the standardized letter of evaluation, used to be recommendation. Emergency medicine does. I think they're in their 10th or 11th year now. And you're required to break into, I believe it's 4 categories of where that student falls. And then independently of that, you say whether you would want that person in your residency or not. And of note, the top 3 categories have no problems matching. So where we thought that very good was not as, was the kiss of death, it turns out that if you look at a trusted, standardized way of doing it, that students don't get penalized. And indeed, there's a belief among some of the program directors that people get better matches and that the programs get a wider range of people because they can sort of control for who hits the ground running and who maybe needs a little bit of extra cardiovascular stuff, kind of thing. So we were able to look back at that. Being able to be flexible as the MSPE moves forward, because curricula are changing, people are going to, are changing the criterion that they're using for evaluation, and being able to make that flexible within 7 pages is also going to be a challenge. I think that's going to happen when we have the electronic version, when it goes to ERIS. We're hoping that, for those of you that aren't program directors, when you're a program director and you're looking at ERIS applications, you can actually set up your own way of looking at it on the page. So we hope to do that with the MSPE, so that if I'm, an internal medicine program at the University of Washington and I'm looking for service, this and that, so that you can set it up so that when the MSPE gets delivered to your place, those things are highlighted and prioritized or put up front. The other more nefarious part of me is, like, once it's electronic, we'll be able to see what people are looking at and how long they're looking at things and what becomes important. It ultimately will help us figure these things out. And I think that was all I wanted to say. It was a lot to cover. I apologize for the rapidity.